The mountain range had no name that mattered anymore. Old survey maps called it Sector 9, a string of grey peaks pushed up out of the ground long before any human ship had touched the sky above this world. Daniel had stopped caring about names 3 winters ago, on the day the mining outpost below packed up its last transport and left without him. He had asked too many questions about missing supply shipments and dead scouting teams, and the company decided a man like that was not worth the fuel to carry home. Since then, the peaks had become his entire world. He knew every ridge, every cave mouth, every place where snowmelt turned to ice by midday. He had built a shelter out of scrap plating pulled from an old survey drone, wedged into a crack in the rock where the wind could not reach. It was not much, but it kept him alive, and after 3 years, alive was enough. That morning, the sky turned a strange color before the storm came, not the usual gray of a mountain squall, but a deep violet, streaked with threads of white light that crawled across the clouds like veins. Daniel had seen storms like this only twice before, both times followed by tremors deep in the rock. He gathered his gear quickly and started back toward his shelter, moving fast along a path he could have walked blind. He was halfway there when the ground shook. Not a small tremor, but a real one, hard enough to knock loose stones from the cliffs above. A section of the ridge ahead of him cracked and slid, burying the narrow trail under a wave of broken rock. Daniel threw himself back against the mountain wall and waited for the dust to settle, coughing, his ears ringing. When the dust cleared, he heard something under the rubble, a sound he had never heard on this mountain before. High-pitched, thin and painful, almost like crying, but layered with something else, something that did not sound like any animal in his memory. He hesitated only a moment before moving toward the sound, pulling rocks aside with bare hands raw from years of hard living. Under a slab of stone nearly too heavy for one man to lift, he found them. 3 small creatures pressed together in a hollow, scaled and shivering, no bigger than housecats, but shaped like nothing from Earth. Their skin shimmered faintly even in the dim storm light, gold and gray and deep blue, and each one had a pair of half-formed wings folded tight against its body. Their eyes, when they opened, were far too aware for something so small. Daniel had read the files, back when the outpost still had files worth reading. Rumors of large reptilian life forms deep in the mountains, dismissed by the company as exaggerated reports from spooked scouts. He had never believed them. Now 3 of the rumors were staring up at him, trembling, trapped under a rockslide that should have crushed them. He did not think long. He dug the rest of the rubble away with his hands, ignoring the cuts and the cold, until all 3 creatures were free. The moment they were loose, they scrambled toward him instead of away, pressing against his legs, too weak and too frightened to do anything else. There was no nest nearby that he could see, no larger creature coming to claim them. Whatever had happened to their mother, they were alone now. The storm was not finished. Lightning cracked somewhere close, and the wind picked up sharp with ice. Daniel made a decision he would spend the rest of his life explaining, even to himself. He wrapped the 3 creatures inside his jacket, tucked against his chest for warmth, and started the long climb back to his shelter, moving as fast as the mountain would allow. By the time he reached the crack in the rock that served as his home, his hands had gone numb, and his legs were shaking from the climb. He laid the 3 creatures down near the small heater he had built from salvaged parts, and only then did he really look at them in the light. They were beautiful in a way nothing on this cold grey mountain had any right to be. Scales that caught the light like polished metal, claws no longer than a fingernail but already sharp, small ridges along their backs that would one day, he guessed, grow into something much larger. One of them, the smallest, had scales the color of hot coals, deep red fading to black at the edges. Another was the pale blue-gray of a storm cloud, with faint lines along its back that seemed to spark when it moved. The third was solid gray, heavy-bodied even as a hatchling, built low and sturdy like the stone around them. They watched him with those unsettling eyes, too intelligent for creatures so young, and made no move to run. If anything, they leaned closer to him, drawn to the warmth of his body and the heater beside them. Daniel sat back against the cold rock wall of his shelter and let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. He had come to this mountain alone, left behind by people who decided he did not matter. Now, in the middle of a storm that should have killed him, three creatures that should not exist had chosen him instead of running from him. He did not know yet what they were or what saving them would cost him. He only knew that for the first time in 3 years, the silence of the mountain had been broken by something other than wind, and he was not ready to let it go. 3 days after the storm, the shelter smelled different. Not bad, just different, like wet stone and something faintly metallic that Daniel could not place until he realized it came from the three creatures curled together near his heater. He had not slept much since bringing them in, checking on them through the night the way a new parent checks on a child, though he would never have described it that way out loud. He decided on names without much thought, the way people do when something needs a name and there is no one else around to argue. The red one, always first to move and first to complain when the heater ran low, he called Cinder. The blue-gray one, quiet and watchful, with those faint spark lines along its back, became Storm. The heavy gray one, slow to react, but strong enough to push the other two out of the way when it wanted the warmest spot by the fire, he named Flint. Feeding them turned out to be the first real problem. He had no idea what young dragons ate, if dragons was even the right word for them. He tried dried meat from his stores first, and Cinder took to it immediately, snapping it down with a hunger that surprised him. Storm was pickier, sniffing everything twice before eating. Flint ate whatever was put in front of it, methodically, without complaint, like a machine designed for exactly that purpose. It was on the 4th night that Daniel first noticed something strange. He had been sitting with his back against the rock wall, half asleep, when a feeling crossed his mind that was not his own. A flash of hunger, sharp and immediate, followed by a wave of something like frustration. He opened his eyes to find Cinder staring directly at him from across the shelter, and the food bowl was empty. He told himself it was coincidence. Tired minds played tricks, and 3 years alone on a mountain could do strange things to a person, but it happened again the next day and the day after that. Not words, nothing so clear as that, but flashes of feeling that lined up exactly with what the hatchlings were doing or wanting. Fear when Storm got too close to the edge of a ledge outside the shelter. Comfort, warm and simple, when Daniel sat close enough for all three of them to press against his sides. He started testing it without meaning to. He would think of a word, food or danger or come here, and watch to see if any of the three reacted before he said anything out loud or moved his hands. More often than not, one of them would lift its head or shift position exactly when he expected. It was not a clean, reliable thing, more like static catching a signal now and then, but it was real, and it scared him more than the storm ever had. Whatever these creatures were, they were not simple animals. Animals did not reach into a person's mind, even a little. Animals did not watch a stranger with eyes that seemed to be doing the same math he was doing, deciding whether to trust him the same way he was deciding whether to trust them. The old company radio scanner, one of the few working pieces of equipment Daniel had kept from his outpost days, still picked up chatter sometimes, weak and broken by the mountains between him and the settlement below. On the 5th day, sitting with Flint asleep against his leg, he caught a fragment of a transmission that made his stomach turn cold. Words like scale extraction and confirmed sighting and target species. He turned the volume down until it was barely audible, glancing at the 3 hatchlings sleeping peacefully nearby, and listened harder. The company below had not left this world because there was nothing left to take. They had left the old mining site because they found something better. Somewhere in these mountains, something with scales worth more per gram than any mineral they had been pulling out of the ground. Daniel had assumed it was rumor and exaggeration, the same as the old stories about large reptilian life. Now, with 3 small dragons breathing softly beside him, he understood exactly what the company's scouts had been sent to find. If they knew there were hatchlings, they would know there was a nest somewhere, or had been one, and they would not stop looking until they found it, or found what was left of it. Daniel sat in the near dark of his shelter for a long time after that, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of the 3 creatures who had, without asking him, made him responsible for their survival. He thought about the crushed rockslide where he had found them, and wondered for the first time if it had really been a storm that caused it, or something else entirely. Whatever the answer was, one thing had become clear. These 3 were not safe here, not with company scouts already moving through the mountains looking for exactly what he was hiding. And if they were not safe, then neither was he. He reached out slowly and rested a hand on Flint's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of its breathing. A faint warmth pushed back against his mind, something like trust, something like relief. Daniel did not understand it fully yet, this strange connection growing between them, but he understood enough to know it was not something he could walk away from now. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the first far-off sound of something mechanical moving through the passes below. The sound Daniel had heard on the wind turned into something he could not ignore by the next afternoon. A low mechanical hum, steady and patient, moving up through the lower passes below his shelter. He had spent enough years around company equipment to recognize the sound of scout drones, the kind used for mapping terrain and searching for exactly the kind of thing he was hiding inside his small rock shelter. He kept the 3 hatchlings close that day, watching the narrow trail below through a gap in the stone with a pair of old field glasses, another piece of salvage from his outpost days. 2 scouts moved along the ridgeline, dressed in company gray, each carrying handheld scanners that swept slowly across the rock face as they walked. Behind them floated a small drone, its sensor array turning in a slow, careful arc. Daniel had survived 3 winters alone by staying invisible, by making sure nothing about his shelter caught the eye of a passing patrol. That had been easy when he had nothing worth finding. It was not easy now, with 3 creatures whose scales, according to the fragment of radio chatter he had caught, were worth more than the entire mining operation below had ever pulled from the ground. Cinder picked up on the tension first. Daniel felt it before he saw it, a spike of nervous energy pressing against his mind, sharp and restless. He put a hand on the hatchling's back and thought as clearly as he could, be still, stay quiet, though he had no real idea if the thought was landing the way he meant it to. Cinder settled, but the flicker in its eyes told him the message had come through, at least in part. The scouts moved closer over the next hour, following the same trail Daniel used to reach the shelter. He weighed his options in the cramped space, feeling the walls close in around him in a way they never had before. Running was not really an option, not with 3 hatchlings barely able to walk on their own, and not with the drone's scanner able to pick up heat and movement from a distance. Staying still and hopping to be missed was a gamble he was not willing to take, not with how close the trail passed to his shelter's entrance. He decided on something else instead. If the drone was scanning for heat and movement in a straight sweep, then the answer was to give it something else to find, somewhere else. Daniel grabbed an old heat pack from his supplies, the kind meant to warm frozen hands during long nights on watch, cracked it to activate the chemical reaction, and threw it as far as he could down a side ravine away from the shelter. He followed it a moment later with a second one, further along, creating a false trail of heat signatures leading away from where the hatchlings were hiding. It was not a perfect plan. It relied on the drone reading the heat spikes as more interesting than a careful sweep of the rock face, and it relied on Daniel being fast enough to lay the trail and get back before the scouts closed the distance. He moved low and quick along the outside of the ridge, keeping to shadow, years of mountain living making his steps sure even under pressure. The drone took the bait. Its sensor array swung sharply toward the ravine, and a moment later both scouts changed direction, moving to investigate. Daniel dropped flat against the rock and waited, heart pounding, as they passed close enough that he could hear their voices carried on the wind, sharp and irritated, arguing about false readings and wasted time. He thought it was over until one of the scouts stopped near the entrance to his shelter, close enough that Daniel could see the scanner in the man's hand pulse yellow, then briefly orange. His stomach dropped. The scanner had caught something, faint but real, coming from inside the rock. Daniel did not wait to see what would happen next. He moved without thinking, coming up from the shadows behind the scout with the same rock hammer he used for digging into frozen ground. It was not a fight he wanted, but it was one he could not avoid, and 3 years of hard mountain labor had put more strength into his arms than any office worker in Company Grey was ready for. The scout went down before he could raise an alarm, and the second one, turning too late, met the same fate a moment after. Daniel stood over them, breathing hard, hands shaking with the sudden crash of adrenaline leaving his body. He had not killed them, only stunned them badly enough that they would wake up sore and confused, but the drone above was already turning, its sensors locking onto the disturbance. He grabbed a loose stone and threw it hard enough to knock the drone from the air, sending it crashing down the slope in a shower of sparks. It would not be enough. A company patrol did not send scouts without expecting reports, and silence from this pair would bring more of them, better armed and less careless. Back inside the shelter, all three hatchlings were pressed together near the entrance, watching him with wide eyes as he came in breathing hard, blood on his knuckles from the fight. Cinder pushed forward first, nudging against his leg, and Daniel felt a wave of something through their strange connection that he could only describe as gratitude, and fear, and a question he did not know how to answer. They were not safe here anymore, not after today. Whatever came next, the mountain that had hidden him for 3 years could not hide all four of them for much longer. Sleep did not come easy that night, and Daniel gave up trying an hour before dawn, choosing instead to sit near the shelter entrance and watch the sky slowly change from black to gray. His knuckles ached from the fight the day before, and his mind kept circling back to the 2 scouts he had left unconscious on the ridge, wondering how much time he had before more came looking. It was Storm who noticed the change in the light first, lifting its head from where it had been curled against Flint's side, ears, if they could be called that, twitching toward the growing brightness outside. A moment later, all 3 hatchlings were awake, moving with a purpose Daniel had not seen from them before. Cinder walked straight to him and pressed its head against his hand, insistent in a way that felt different from its usual demand for food or warmth. Daniel had learned over the past week to trust the faint impressions that crossed his mind when the hatchlings wanted something, but this one was harder to read, layered and complicated, nothing like the simple flashes of hunger or fear he had grown used to. It felt less like a request and more like a memory, something old pressing forward through 3 small minds that had no business holding memories this deep. He followed them outside, curious despite the dangers still hanging over the mountain from the day before. The 3 hatchlings moved together along the ridge, slower than a healthy adult of their kind surely could have managed, but certain of their direction in a way that left no room for doubt. They were not wandering, they were leading. The path they chose was not one Daniel had ever walked in 3 years of exploring these peaks. It cut sharply behind a wall of stone he had always assumed was solid rock, a narrow crevice barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways, hidden by the angle of the cliff above it, and a thick growth of hardy mountain moss that had clearly been left undisturbed for a very long time. He would never have found it on his own. He was not sure the company's scanners would have found it either, tucked into a fold of the mountain that seemed almost designed to be missed. Cinder went first, small enough to squeeze through easily, followed by Storm and then Flint, who had to turn sideways and push hard to fit through the narrow gap. Daniel came last, scraping his shoulders against cold stone on both sides, the crevice so tight in places that he had to exhale fully just to slide through. The passage opened after only a few dozen meters into something Daniel was not prepared for. A tunnel, clearly not natural, its walls too smooth and too evenly carved to be the work of wind and water. Faint lines ran along the stone at regular intervals, worn nearly flat by time, but still visible if he looked closely, patterns that reminded him of something between writing and decoration, unlike anything from any human colony record he had ever seen. The 3 hatchlings moved through the tunnel with the same confident pace, occasionally pausing to look back and make sure Daniel was still following, their eyes catching what little light filtered in from cracks in the rock above. He felt, more than heard, something that was almost like reassurance passing between them and him, a sense that this place, whatever it was, held no danger for them, only history. They walked for what felt like an hour, the tunnel sloping gently downward, the air growing warmer and strangely fresher the deeper they went, carrying a faint mineral smell unlike the thin cold air of the surface. Daniel kept one hand trailing along the wall, partly for balance and partly because touching the strange carved stone made the whole experience feel more real, less like something his exhausted mind might be imagining. He thought about the 2 things sitting uneasily together in his mind. First, that these hatchlings, only days old by any reasonable guess, seemed to know this path the way a person knows the layout of their own childhood home, not learned but somehow remembered, carried forward from creatures far older than them. Second, that whatever built this tunnel had been far more advanced, or at least far more patient, than the small nest he had imagined finding when he first pulled them from the rock slide. The tunnel began to widen the further they went, the smooth carved walls giving way to something that looked almost natural again, as though the builders of this place had worked with the mountain rather than against it, shaping it without destroying its bones. Faint sounds reached him from somewhere ahead, low and resonant, not quite animal and not quite mechanical, echoing off stone in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up. Cinder stopped walking and turned back to look at him fully for the first time since they had entered the crevice, eyes steady and far too knowing for something so young. Daniel felt a single clear impression push into his mind, stronger than anything before it, simple enough that even his uncertain understanding of their connection could not mistake it. Home! He looked past the three hatchlings toward the source of the sound ahead, a faint golden light beginning to glow somewhere deeper in the tunnel, and felt his pulse quicken with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but sat somewhere uneasy between the two. Whatever waited at the end of this path, it was clear now that the three creatures he had saved from a rock slide were not orphans wandering alone in the mountains by accident. They were bringing him somewhere they belonged, and somewhere, he suspected, that very few outsiders had ever been allowed to see. The golden light grew stronger with every step, until it was no longer a distant glow, but a wide, warm brightness, filling a cavern so large that Daniel's mind struggled to measure it against anything he had seen before. The ceiling rose far overhead, disappearing into shadow, while veins of pale crystal running through the rock caught the light from somewhere below and scattered it in soft golden patterns across every surface. He stopped at the edge of the tunnel opening, staying half hidden in the shadow of the stone, not entirely by choice. His legs had simply stopped moving on there in the moment he saw what filled the cavern floor below. Dragons, real, fully grown dragons, larger than anything he had imagined even after finding the hatchlings, their bodies the size of transport vehicles, wings folded along backs covered in scales that shimmered with the same colors he had seen on Cinder, Storm, and Flint, only deeper, richer, worn with age. He counted 5 of them at first glance, though the shifting light and uneven ground made it hard to be certain, resting or moving slowly among structures that looked half-built and half-grown into the surrounding rock. Cinder, Storm, and Flint moved forward without hesitation, crossing the open cavern floor toward the nearest of the great dragons, a creature with scales the color of old bronze and eyes that tracked Daniel's position the moment he stepped fully into the light. A low sound rumbled through the cavern, deep enough that Daniel felt it in his chest before he consciously heard it, and every dragon in the space turned toward him at once. He had faced company scouts with weapons the day before, and felt less afraid than he did standing alone under the gaze of 5 creatures who could, without much effort, end his life in an instant. He kept his hands visible and still, remembering some old instinct about not appearing as a threat, though he had no idea if that instinct meant anything to minds this different from his own. The bronze-scaled dragon lowered its head slowly, bringing its eyes level with Daniel's, close enough that he could feel warm breath against his face. He felt something press into his mind then, far stronger and clearer than anything the hatchlings had managed, a wave of thought too complex for simple words, but carrying meaning all the same. Not a threat, a question: who are you, and why do our young trust you? Daniel answered the only way he knew how, holding perfectly still and thinking as clearly as he could about the storm, the rock slide, the 3 small creatures buried and afraid, and his decision to dig them free without knowing what they were. He did not know if thoughts alone could carry that much detail, but the dragon's eyes seemed to soften slightly, and the pressure in his mind eased. An answer came back to him, slower and more careful than a person speaking, but unmistakably meant for him. The bronze dragon was named. In a rough approximation his mind could hold on to, something like Ridge, the eldest among those still alive in this hidden place. The others gathered closer as Ridge shared, mind to mind, what had brought Daniel through the tunnel, and slowly, cautiously, the tension in the cavern began to ease. Over the next hours, Sitting near a small fire the dragons had somehow built and maintained deep beneath the mountain, Daniel learned the truth the company had been hunting for. The crystalline scales, prized so highly by traders and corporations, were not simply valuable minerals growing on tough hide. They were part of a dragon's life cycle, shed naturally with age and regrown slowly, carrying within them something like memory, passed down when eaten by hatchlings from their own bloodline, allowing knowledge and instinct to survive from one generation to the next. The scouts and hunters below did not understand or did not care what they were truly harvesting. Wild-scale hunting, tearing scales from living or recently killed dragons instead of waiting for the natural shedding, had already wiped out most of the species across this mountain range. Ridge and the small group remaining were the last of a population that had once filled every peak for hundreds of miles, driven into hiding generations ago, sealed behind hidden paths like the one Cinder, Storm, and Flint had somehow remembered despite being only days old. Daniel realized then what he had stumbled into. The three hatchlings had not simply survived a rockslide by chance. Somewhere above, before the storm, before Daniel found them, something had gone wrong: a scattered nest, a mother lost or taken, and three young dragons left to make their way alone toward the only place their inherited memory told them was safe. He had crossed their path at the exact moment they needed help most, and in turn, they had trusted him with something far larger than gratitude. The company patrol from the day before would report back eventually, one way or another. And when they did, more scouts would come looking, better armed and less careless than the first two. Ridge understood this as clearly as Daniel did, sharing with him images of past encounters, other hidden groups discovered and lost over the years to hunters who valued profit over any understanding of what they were destroying. Sitting in the golden light of that hidden cavern, surrounded by the last of an ancient species and three hatchlings who had chosen to trust him without hesitation, Daniel understood that walking away was no longer something he could choose to do. Whatever came next, whatever the company sent up the mountain in response to two missing scouts, he would be standing here to face it, not as an outsider who had stumbled into someone else's war, but as something closer to family. 3 days passed in the hidden cavern before the mountain gave its first warning. A distant tremor felt more than heard, followed by Ridge lifting his great head sharply toward the tunnel entrance with an alertness that spread through every dragon in the space at once. Daniel felt it too, through the strange bond he now shared not only with the three hatchlings, but faintly with the older dragons as well, a ripple of unease that needed no translation. The company had found the tunnel. Not the hidden crevice itself, not yet, but close enough. Scanners powerful enough to read heat signatures deep through rock had picked up something in the mountain that did not match any mineral deposit or geological reading in their records. Ridge shared what the eldest dragons could sense through the stone itself, vibrations carried down from the surface, the low grind of heavy machinery being moved into position along the ridge above. Daniel spent those 3 days learning as much as he could about the cavern and the dragons living within it, not out of curiosity alone, but because he understood, better than anyone else present, exactly how a company assault would be organized. He had seen the equipment used to clear old mining tunnels, the drilling rigs and directed charges capable of opening solid rock in hours instead of years. If the company wanted what was hidden in this mountain badly enough, and the value of dragon scales suggested they did, they would not hesitate to blast their way in. He gathered the dragons together as best he could, using a mixture of simple thoughts, gestures, and patience, laying out what he knew about company tactics on a flattened patch of dirt near the fire, marking rough positions with stones the way he might once have planned a supply route back at the outpost. The dragons could not read a map the way a person could, but through the growing bond between them and Daniel's careful explanations, they began to understand the shape of what was coming. The cavern had only 2 real points of entry: the narrow crevice tunnel Daniel had used, too tight for anything but a person or a young dragon to pass through easily, and a second wider passage on the far side that the dragons used themselves, large enough for an adult to fly through with wings folded. If the company forced their way in, it would almost certainly be through the wider passage, using explosives to widen it further if needed. Daniel worked with what he had: salvaged equipment from his shelter, old company tools he had kept for years without knowing why, and now the raw strength of 5 adult dragons and 3 determined hatchlings eager to help in whatever small way they could. He rigged loose sections of the passage ceiling to collapse on command, using cable and old mining charges he had never expected to use again, creating a controlled choke point that would slow any force pushing through from the surface. The attack came on the 4th day, announced first by a deep boom that shook dust from the cavern ceiling, followed by the grinding roar of drilling equipment tearing through rock far too close for comfort. Daniel positioned himself near the wider passage with Ridge close beside him, the old dragon's presence steady and reassuring even as the noise grew louder. The company forces broke through faster than Daniel had hoped. A dozen armed scouts, backed by 2 heavy drilling rigs repurposed with weapon mounts, pushing into the passage with the confidence of people who had never expected real resistance. Daniel let them advance exactly as far as his rigged charges required before triggering the collapse, bringing down a controlled section of ceiling that blocked the rear of their formation and sent the front line scrambling in confusion. What followed was chaos, but chaos Daniel had shaped as much as he could. Storm, faster and more agile than the older dragons despite still being young, darted along the passage ceiling using the bond with Daniel to know exactly where friend ended and enemy began, striking with small bursts of the same crackling energy Daniel had noticed sparking along its back since the day they first met. Flint, heavier and slower, planted itself directly in the path of the advancing scouts, using raw size and strength to block their advance, while Ridge and the other elder dragons struck from angles the company had never planned to defend against. Daniel fought alongside them the only way a single human could against armed opponents, using his knowledge of the tunnel's old company tools turned into makeshift weapons, and every hard lesson 3 years of survival on this mountain had taught him. He was not stronger than the scouts, not faster, not better armed. But he understood this mountain, and he understood the creatures fighting beside him, and in the end, that mattered more than any weapon the company had brought. The battle did not last as long as Daniel expected. Cut off from reinforcements by the collapsed passage, faced with dragons far larger and more coordinated than their scanners had predicted, and unable to retreat quickly through rock rigged against them, the scouts surrendered within the hour, their commanding officer forced to accept defeat rather than lose his remaining people to a fight he had clearly not prepared for. The days that followed, word of the hidden dragon sanctuary and the illegal hunting operation feeding it reached colonial authorities far beyond the reach of the local company outpost, carried by Daniel himself through channels the company had never expected a single abandoned worker to access. Investigations followed, slow and imperfect the way such things always were, but enough to end large-scale hunting in the region and place real protections around the mountain for the first time in generations. Daniel remained in the mountains long after the fighting ended, though not alone anymore. Cinder, Storm, and Flint grew steadily larger with each passing season, their bond with him deepening rather than fading with age, and Ridge and the other elders came to treat him as something between a guardian and a strange, welcome addition to their small remaining family. The hidden path that had once led only to secrecy and survival slowly became something else entirely, a careful, guarded bridge between 2 very different kinds of people learning, for the first time in a long while, how to trust each other. The mountains still had no name that mattered to the wider colonies, but for Daniel, and for the dragons who had chosen him, it had finally become something it had not been in a very long time. Home.